Thank you so much for coming along this morning. Ladies, gentlemen, distinguished guests, on behalf of the Climate High-Level Champions Getting to Zero Coalition and UCL, I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the fourth edition of the Climate Action in Shipping Report, Progress Towards the 2030 Breakthrough of at least 5% zero-emission fuel uptake by 2030. I hope everyone on the way into the room had an opportunity to voice their opinion on the board outside about whether we're on track or not to meet the 5% goal by 2030. And hopefully, after the end of this session, it would be great to see if you changed your mind or if you're still sticking with your initial thoughts when you entered the room. So today's launch brings together leaders from across the value chain to discuss the findings of the Progress Report, celebrate the successes of action and leadership that is already happening in the sector, and to build that shared understanding of what's needed to rapidly scale and accelerate progress. I'd like to kick off today's event with a video message from the Climate High-Level Champion for COP30, Mr. Dan Ayoshbi. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this event. You know that almost everything we trade and consume has traveled by sea. And you also know that shipping is still one of the most fossil fuel dependent sectors in the global economy, which brings even more relevance to the challenge we face in changing that. I'm speaking to you today not just as COP30's high-level climate champion, but as someone who has spent decades in transportation, more specifically in the automotive industry. I've seen what it means to change the fuel matrix of a relevant sector as yours. It is challenging, but there is a lot of opportunities on it, and it is possible. As in any of these matters, we need to deal with the bottlenecks. The ones in technology, supply, demand, cost, financing, and policy, among others, that could slow down this transition to a scalable zero-emission shipping. There is already a commitment to get at least 5% of shipping fuel from these zero-emission sources, and ideally up to 10%. This is very positive. But the reality is, unless we make some changes, we risk falling short on this goal. The Climate Action in Shipping report we are launching today tracks how well the sector is doing, and it is a mixed picture. First, for the good news, a lot of the technology needed is available. Methanol engines are already in commercial use. The first ammonia engines just became available. Production capacity for zero-emission fuels could reach zero point 0.8 exajoules of energy by 2030, more than enough to meet the 5% goal. We are also happy to see the IMO's new net zero framework. It includes a fuel standard, regulation of allowed emissions, and greenhouse gas emissions pricing. However, we still have a lot to do. What qualifies as zero or near zero emission fuels remains to be defined. We need to nail down this clarity so that investors don't hold back. And the demand side is where we're really falling behind. Many new vessels still aren't zero emission fuel capable. At the current rates, only 1/3 of the fleet will be ready by 2030. It is important to recognize that the addition of not zero emission ships to the fleet at this point in time, considering the lifetime of these assets, seems to be a very risky proposition for all the related stakeholders. We need to make the case for zero emission ships even stronger, not only from a risk perspective, but also developing favorable financing and public policy support for it. The route for non-sustainable development is not a feasible one. And lastly, in my role of representing all non-state actors, I would like to encourage us to increase participation from civil society and coastal communities in this debate. We need to ensure they can participate fully, submitting proposals and integrating negotiations. COP30's action agenda is the blueprint to move us from promises like getting at least 5% of maritime fuel from zero emission sources to implementation. It includes 6 axes with 30 key objectives and its solutions. Shipping is one of them. Because shipping is a core part of the action agenda, we know it will have a strong presence at COP30. But that presence needs to reflect real action. We need to show where momentum is building, be honest about the bottlenecks that remain, and implement the solutions discussed here. COP30 could be a showcase for this sector with all of its complexity and its delivers on its commitments. From ports to ship owners, fuel producers to financial institutions, we have seen consistent signals of effective progress. That's why I'm thankful for each and every one of you shaping regulation, financing innovation, building zero-emission ships, and designing the systems that will power them. In Brazil, we call this the spirit of the mutirão. Every actor coming together to complete a task that no one person could carry alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Dan for doing that video message. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us here today. But I think he's set out the challenge that's well ahead and highlighted some of the key successes and shown that shipping is integral to the COP30 action agenda going forward. So unfortunately, the Secretary General is stuck in traffic and running a little bit late. So as to be expected during London International Shipping Week. So we will move now to the fireside chat with Nigel Topping and Joanna Christensen, led by Tristan Smith. So I'd like to welcome you to the stage to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. So we've got the pleasure of a brief chat before we get to see some of the detail of the analysis. And I'm going to start this by prefacing the conversation here with the fact that I hope, and Nigel and Johanna can contradict me if I get this wrong, that we are similarly minded that it's surprising how something that is desirable theoretically from an environment perspective, but also perceived as impossible, can quickly turn to the inevitable if the conditions are right. And if we're in that situation and we're in those surprises, or the world where surprises have in the past happened in other transitions, how can we better prepare? How can we make sure that we're not surprised and that surprise doesn't create chaos or disruption or pain for those in the sector and for those outside, as well as the climate champion was saying, how do we make sure that we hit goals? How do we avoid pain at the same time? So I guess just to give Nigel and Johanna a quick heads up that we might talk a bit about that, but also how do we prepare as a community to avoid those surprises? Now, one of the ways that we can do that is we can analyse things and we can write long reports, and that's something that at UCL we love doing, but we recognise that that's not the only way to do it. So first of all, please listen to what Tomoko says in his presentation, but if you can, please read the report, because actually the measurement of some of these indicators and some of the fine detail in that report is really hard for him to convey in 10 minutes. And so please go to look at the data, because we think that data is useful. It gives you some way of being prepared. But we can also be proactive. And to be proactive, we need to learn from experience, and we need to use a reading of sentiment and an understanding of sentiment. And that's why I'm so pleased to have both Johanna and Nigel here, because I think they bring huge amounts of experience of how transitions have happened outside of the bubble of shipping, and also a reading of sentiment that often in the ivory tower over in Gower Street we sometimes lack, because we are buried deep in the numbers and trying to be rigorous rather than necessarily understand what everyone's feeling. So I'm going to start by asking you both, what's your reaction to whether you think we can move from something seemingly impossible into something that will become inevitable, and also what your sort of initial reactions are, your experience of how these things have unfolded elsewhere, or how you're perceiving them to unfold in this particular instance, your read on the sentiment. And I'll start with Johanna, ladies first.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tristan, and thanks for that introduction. I think it's sort of interesting you say this about this, something that goes from an idea to something that's inevitable, or from an ambition to something that's inevitable in such a short amount of time. I was reminded coming into this building this morning that 7 years ago, in June of 2017, Tristan, Catherine, a few others in this room here today, we held a workshop here. And at the time, we were talking about the early signals that there was a shift about in shipping, that there was a change happening in shipping where its response to the climate crisis was beginning to come into focus. And what might we do collectively to help support that shift and help support that change and support the sector in making that transition? And I think what that helps me with here is to see how different the world of shipping looks today than it did in 2017, and where we've really moved from ideas and concepts on paper to real things operating on the water today. And so we've gone from ambitions and ideas to proof of concept to fundamentally things happening in the real world. And of course, those things that are happening in the real world and that have progressed over time, they're at this moment, they're pockets of change. So they're not system-wide change yet, they're pockets of change. But what I can see and what gives me confidence is how quickly that has happened and how we're beginning to see those pockets of change connecting with one another and starting to move towards system change. Maybe let's start there.
Thank you, Johanna. Passing that to Nigel.
Well, just a few thoughts. I think it is really, we're all looking forward all the time, right? Because we're facing the problems we've got now and we're trying to solve forward. So it is always worth looking back, say 5 years or 10 years. 5 years ago when we launched the idea of breakthroughs, one of the crucial ideas, which I think is at the heart of the learning process, is this idea, this fact that modular technologies exhibit learning curves. And that's the dynamic, that's the economic dynamic or the innovation dynamic behind exponential adoption. So like a 5% by 2030 goal doesn't feel very ambitious. If you think 5% in a decade, it's going to take 2 centuries to decarbonize the sector, right? If you think linearly. So, but I think one of the things really important in terms of surprises, and I think Dan referenced bottlenecks. I think more and more I see that these systemic changes that Johanna talks about require the whole system, the whole value chain and the supporting policy environment to move more or less in sync. And you can see the evidence of that going wrong in many countries in the world where advice about the declining costs of renewables did not embrace the reality of learning curves. And so a lot of countries have woken up to oh my God, we've got loads more renewables than we expected and the grid's not ready. Right, but the grid takes a longer time to turn the grid around. So the lack of thinking through the whole exponentially means you get one bit going, and that in terms of sentiment, again you think of EVs. If the charging infrastructure doesn't keep up with the sales, then you end up with a bad consumer experience, and then the sentiment goes south, and everyone starts saying EVs are rubbish. So both technically, this kind of synchronization and sentiment-wise, it's super important. And I think one of the best examples of where this is managed really well is in tech. Everybody here uses the term 4G and 5G. I don't know if any of you are telecoms engineers. I have no idea what the difference is between 4G and 5G, except I presume 5G is better, right? But that's an industry-wide pathway that's been established with a whole set of synchronized developments across the whole value chain, the consumer experience, the chips, the transmission infrastructure. So I think that this combination of understanding the exponential nature and synchronizing the whole sector is really important to manage sentiment, because if you get out of kilter, then somebody gets annoyed.
Do you want to add anything? Or I thank you both for those responses. I think that's really helpful. And I would say, like your comment just then about this curve, which I think we can all do with our hands sometimes, not very helpful or it's very awkward. But I've been surprised how many presentations I've seen already this week where I've seen the nonlinear S-curve the sigmoid curve, which is what we have worked on for so many years now with Global Maritime Forum as a conceptualization of what this could look like as a way to prepare. And I think that's a really encouraging sign that at least people are thinking about this as a non-linear process, and therefore this 5% isn't just this linear projection as Nigel kind of expressed, but it can be perceived as sometimes, but it's something that is this boost. And that's the basic way to avoid being surprised, is not to be surprised by non-linearity, said the academic. Okay, so the other thing here is that I think is a bit of a theme throughout the years is the idea of an ambition loop. The thing that shipping has is this interplay between both national governments and regional actors, industry initiatives and industry self-standard setting processes, of which there are plentiful examples even within the Global Maritime Forum. And then the global regulator in the form of multilateral regulation that can come from the IMO. And I wondered if, I guess, again, I'm going to ask you both to comment on this. So maybe, Johanna, you've obviously seen how this has been evolving in shipping, and Nigel, you can see it from many different sectors, perspectives. But could we talk a bit about the ambition loop and how we can use our experience and history experience of ambition loops to think in this particular instance?
I was hoping you were going to go to Nigel first, but yeah, I can try.
We
in part because I want to recognize that I think Nigel, you've been such a big part of defining the concept of an ambition loop, and you've been working within that sort of framework for decades, really, right? And so the way we think about it, and that we think about it in the work that we do in the Global Maritime Forum and with the Global Maritime Forum community, is really thinking about how can the private sector contribute its part to that ambition loop. And where I think it becomes most evident is that so there's a lot of sentiment about in the shipping sector at the moment that the fuels will not be ready. There won't be enough fuels to make this transition. And it's true, if you take a static picture right now, that would seem to be the case, right? But I think the way we think about this is that it's a dynamic interaction between different parties and different players taking steps together, taking actions together, so that we change so it's not a static picture, it's a dynamic picture. So the actions that you will hear from Harris, from one of the Greek ship owners, represented later in a panel today, the action that Starbuck takes, that has an impact on the actions of a fuel developer, of a port, of a government, etc. And likewise, the actions that a national government or an IMO or a fuel developer takes has an impact on the kinds of actions that Starbuck can take, right? So that all of these things play together. So it's I think the ambition loop concept helps us define, okay, we can work, we can take steps together, and as others are responding to the steps that we take, it actually changes what we can do, right? So that's maybe how we think about it. And so we've seen examples of it. The Poseidon Principles that were established in 2019 was an effort for a certain stakeholder group to take steps, to make actions that others could respond to. And I think we have seen a really good response from other stakeholders in the sector, building upon the steps that they took in order to take the next steps. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So you're saying we can think about the ambition loop not just as this interplay between the multilateral regulator and the private sector, but also within the private sector it can drive ambition. Thank you. Nigel.
Yeah, no, I think very well put. I don't think it's quite decades, Johanna. That's very kind. But when I was at We Mean Business, we came up with the idea because we were trying to put out normative goals. We were trying to get away from a kind of mentality of what can we confidently predict is possible, to more like what could we do if we really tapped into our amazingness as entrepreneurs and innovators and motivated human beings, right? Because that's when we get the best out of ourselves, not when we say, what's in the sort of average range of the possible, to like, what do we actually need to do, and what if we backed ourselves? And and of course Moore's law is the famous example. It's not a law. It's an assertion of collective confidence in our ability to innovate. And so so initially our idea was you present a much more sophisticated idea of an ambition loop. Back at the We Mean Business days, we were really just thinking, how can a critical mass of businesses send a signal to policymakers to embolden policymakers to improve the ambition of policy, which then emboldens more, and then you get that feedback loop. As you point out, there are many ambition loops, like there's a supply and demand. Like if a bunch of cargo owners say in the future they only want to buy zero carbon cargo services, that's a pretty strong signal that we've always known that. So I think tapping into those, I think importantly, it's kind of a blindingly obvious point, right? That what we do influences others around us, right? But a lot of the complex economic models which drive forecasts don't embrace that dynamic, right? Which is kind of weird, So Schumpeterian, creative destruction is quite difficult to model, and so I had a real light bulb moment about 10 years ago. I was reading a very good climate scenario report written by one of the leading pension consultants, and they used carbon pricing as a proxy measure for the strength of policy. So a very beautiful scenario, 4 scenarios with clever names, jazz, harmony, whatever, cacophony, whatever. And it was very interesting, and each one of them had this sort of confidently drawn carbon pricing curve. The devil's always in the detail of it, in the way we think about the future, right? In the like footnote 17 said, the carbon pricing curves have all been developed using the best available integrated assessment models, but readers should be aware that these do not include either entrepreneurial behavior or politics. So I'm like, apart from the 2 things that influence the direction of technology, that's a great founding assumption, right? So again, because there's this human element of like a desire to shape the future, which is what the ambition loop is trying to tap into, and it's like the signals we give about our commitment to the future affect, as you say, they affect others all around us in ways that we often don't understand, and that's what can then be the driving force of this flywheel of exponential change.
Can I add something to that? It's just I'm so glad you made that particular comment, because it's sort of interesting, because I think it's one of the reasons that shipping has moved so fast. Actually, it's an industry of entrepreneurs at the end of it. At the end of the day, it's such an entrepreneurially oriented. I don't think it necessarily thinks of itself as an innovative sector, but it's a deeply, deeply entrepreneurial sector. And I think that speaks to that sort of element of that sort of opportunistic thinking, that opportunity framing in the sector. I think is, I don't know. For me, that sparks that's recognizable in this sector,
right?
In my view, and
a
reason to be optimistic.
Yes, and actually, one thing you were just talking about, the risk of being overwhelmed by, like, it's impossible because how many ships are there in a can't? There's not enough fuel capacity, and there's not enough engine capacity, and there's not enough demand. I think it's really important to kind of concentrate on one doubling at a time. If there are 250 zero carbon ships now, how do we get to 500? If there's X amount of clean fuel, how do we get to 2x? Because when you think about and there's a good example in sustainable aviation fuel, right? In 2020, sustainable aviation fuel represented 0.01%. So 1/100th of 1%. And now there are mandates in place in several parts of the world to get that to 10%. That's 1,000x. So again, 10% seems lame in the face of 100. But if you can 1,000x in a decade, you can probably 10x in the next 2 decades, and then you get to 100.
I can't believe I'm on a panel where people are essentially having a conversation about the naive ignorance of techno-economic models without me. So I have to interject, because this is like my dream come true, because that's essentially what we did for 10, 12 years. We wrote those models, the spreadsheet models that will give you a forecast, and that was how we kind of got our profile. But it wasn't until I came across Domagoj, who's presenting in a second, who comes from a different school of thought, which is very resonant with, I think, everything you've both been saying, that he challenged our research group and its mindset around these naive techno-economic models, which we're now blowing out of the water. But I think that's the message really to the sector, apart from anything else, is just be very careful about your spreadsheet models, because they will underestimate how fast things will change and have a lot of conservatism because of what they're not including. Which is a great segue into, so what happens next? We're here at this moment. We're going to obviously adopt the net zero framework in a few weeks' time, no questions. And then we're going to move into some detail in the guidelines, and the COP process will carry on. So can you help us to think through what in particular do you see as the things we need to get right as we go into that period where this becomes much more real? And to set you a challenge, you have to answer this question without mentioning any words that rhyme with rump or pump or plump. Nigel, you can go first.
Well, I get the strong. I mean, I'm not in or of this sector, so I'm an observer. But I get the sense that this sector is actually very well organised in terms of that. Those of you, I mean, no, it's always worse on the inside, right? So I see a slight grimace there. But I think, you know, in terms of the choreography of the whole industry and the whole value chain. So I think the things that come to mind in answer to your question are getting, you know, turning the pathways into a normative pathway. You know, you can almost think of it, what's the 4G, 5G, 6G pathway for the industry? Really concentrating on the next one or two doublings, not worrying about how do we solve for the last mile. And I think there's often a risk of solving for the current constraint, because that's the one where the pain is. But I think by focusing on the next doubling, making sure that we're solving for the next constraint. Otherwise we risk lurching from one constraint to the other, and that's the importance of that exponential pathway. If we just linearly solve for let's say the current constraint is skills, and we manage to get enough skills for the current level, then we're already behind the curve. So we've got to be solving for the next doubling. But I think that choreography and being agile, right? You know, because we don't know what's going to happen in 10, 15 years. We can however clever our models are, right? It's definitely unknown. But so that coordination on a reasonably short timescale of pathways and then iteration, the learning that you talked to.
Thank you, Johanna.
I'm glad it looks good from the outside. I think it betrays a little bit the messiness on the inside, and I guess there's I mean, right now, if we're looking at the inside, there's a lot of action happening. It's a bit scattered, right? It is scattered, and it's scattered across the value chain, across the sector, and that all needs to be linked up and move forward. But I think in all of that, it's worth remembering that the shipping sector is not moving alone. There are other sectors around that are moving together with this sector. And actually, the actions of other sectors also influence what happens in shipping. And always remembering that, you know, you were talking about aviation before, there's steel, there's aluminum, there's just the broader energy system is moving alongside shipping, and again, action here begets action in another sector, and vice versa. So always also kind of keeping that openness to what's happening in other sectors. Other industrial hubs are moving as well, and really making sure that we're keeping an eye out for changes and the next hurdles in their systems as well, so that we can think about how can, you know, someone else's challenge might be our opportunity and vice versa, right? So really thinking about the whole thing moving together is really what I would say, and working with other sectors to unlock our opportunities as well. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I think you want me to wind up. Good. Okay, I think that's clear. Thank you very much. That was sorry that we slightly juggled the timing, but thank you to Nigel and to Johanna for their responses and thoughts on this, and please do see what Domagoj has to say, hopefully when he goes into the detail to accompany this experience and sentiment discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was insightful, made us laugh, and I think it was great to bring all the three parties together who actually co-created this 2030 breakthrough of 5% zero emission fuel for shipping. So it was great to bring everyone back together after that initial creation of that breakthrough. So we have rejigged the program a little bit, but I can see that the Secretary General for the International Maritime Organization has joined us now. So before we move into the detail with Domagoy's presentation and then the industry panel discussion, I'd like to welcome Mr. Arsenio Dominguez to the stage to provide his thoughts on progress and action that is happening in the shipping sector. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm late. Oh, don't worry. I was late for my previous one. I'm already late for the next one. But this is London International Shipping Week. I think that I was too confident that I was going to make it to all the events that I sign up to. Don't link this to the confidence that I have that in October, we're going to adopt the next set of amendments, the fuel standard as well as the pricing mechanism. I'm very confident on that one, more confident than me making it on time throughout the rest of the week. Now, one of the challenges that I always have with events like this, London International Shipping Week, is that the familiar faces in the room. And it's difficult for me to change the narrative, the facts, or to tell you something different. So for some of you, this is going to become very repetitive every time that you see me. So let me see if I can adapt a little bit to what you're talking about today, because it's the launch of the report, which is focusing on 2030. And for that, I want to thank you, because you are looking at the next step in the process at IMO, into the 20% reduction aiming at 30% of GHG emissions, as well as the uptake of 5% aiming for 10% of renewable fuels. And that sends a good message out there as well. This is a process. We're going step by step. We're not running towards the end goal just yet. We're still learning. We know the array of fuels that are out there. We know the challenges with some of those fuels. We're not ruling them out. I'm going to talk about some of the elephants, because I think there's more than one in the room. At IMO, the life cycle assessments is addressing all the fuels that we have right now listed. Yes, that includes LNG. LNG is a transition fuel, as well as it's a fuel in transition. We're still carrying out the evaluations in the assessments. We're looking at new technologies. Even nuclear is on the pipeline for us to assess. And we need to do this because we agreed as an organization to be fuel and technology agnostic. Now, the next set of rules are the ones that are going to incentivize further the production and in particularly the scaling up of the alternative fuels that will be required to decarbonize the sector. And let's face it, other sectors as well, because we will be transporting those fuels for others to benefit as well from our achievements. There's new technologies that are being developed. One of the good work that I also know that the GMF carries out is that assessment and evaluations of all the different projects out there that continue to demonstrate that this is achievable, that this is happening, that we'll make the necessary progress, we'll take the necessary steps, but also address the concerns, because this transition is not free. It's not without its challenges. But hey, challenges is what makes our life even more interesting and more exciting. If it was easy, anybody could do it. And that's a fact. But what I do ask is that you take on board the concerns that are out there. You share the knowledge and the information that you have. I just managed to get the last part of the fireside chat, and this was something that you've been encouraged to do here as well. Right now, and I haven't seen the reports, I'm sure that it will say that we're not at the point of meeting the 5% by 2030. It's 2025. The amendments will be adopted next year. Next month. I blame that on all the events that I've been speaking today. Next month. How many times do I have to say that to correct myself? Next month. Entry into force 2027. And then from then onwards, of course, things will scale up. We knew we had the information in advance that the technology was going to take some time to develop, as well as the scaling up of the fuels. And we were talking or looking into the mid-30s. And all that has been taken into account on the regulatory process. And we are dealing with 176 member states, all agreed back in 2023 that the goal to decarbonize the sector was by around 2050. Yes, there are concerns for some that consider that this may be detrimental to global supply chains, that it would be detrimental to the economies of the countries. Other considers that we're actually not going far enough in addressing climate change, and that is not going to provide the support necessary for this sector to decarbonize. And I want to focus, we're talking about this sector, shipping. We need to start in our house before we can do and assist others. But what we agreed in April was that first step, that consensus approach that will bring us into learning from the experience, acknowledging that all the tools are not there yet, but they are in the process, and not to penalize. And we agree to continue the review of the process, to carry out the assessment on food security, or the impact assessment of our measures. Because this is a marathon, but we are on track in this process. And I do appreciate the exchanges. Let's not criticize each other. Let's understand what everyone's opinions is, because that would allow us to make progress on the areas where we all agree, where we have a lot more information and more facts, to further develop those that have expressed concerns or where we still need additional research. But there's one thing for sure, we won't stop at IMO. We will continue to create global regulations for global shipping. And remember, when you talk about decarbonization, it has to be safe as well. It doesn't hit the headlines. You have heard me say this before, and I will keep repeating it because I want safety to hit the headlines as well. And the human element. We have progress already with the guidelines necessary for the use of ammonia and hydrogen as propulsion fuels. We start the development of the training requirements for methanol and ethanol, and next year the plan is to move into ammonia, and we will go on to other type of fuels and other technologies. So it's not just MEPC that is doing all the work. This is IMO at its best, just spreading the different areas that we have to cover, acknowledging the challenges that we had ahead, but continuing to demonstrate that we are serious about being safe, being secure, being clean, being sustainable. Thank you for your contribution. Keep bringing it to the regulatory process at the organization, because it is welcome. And thank you for the continued support to the work of IMO and for the shipping sector. Apologies again that I'm late, but at least you know that I'm already 10 minutes late for my next event as well. Enjoy the rest of London International Shipping Week, and sincere apologies again.
Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Darko Barisic, and I'm the lead author of the Climate Action and Shipping Report. So I'm here basically to talk to you about the Climate Action and Shipping Report. And before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the rest of the team that's been working hard on this report with me. So there's 7 of us authors, some of whom are in the room, and this is excellent to have some of them here as well. So great acknowledgement there. So first of all, we heard from the fireside chat, and we heard from the IMO Secretary General afterwards. And what we heard there is really about the critical moment that shipping is in at the moment. And Lord and behold, it all led to the launch of the report, the context of what we're saying here today. So what are we talking about when we say 5 to 10% by 2030, about this breakthrough target? What in theoretical terms are we talking about? Well, it goes back to, if you heard in the fireside chat, it goes back to 2020, 2021, when these breakthrough targets was agreed about really understanding what tipping point shipping needs to be in 2030 in terms of alternative fuel adoption to put it in that S-curve trajectory to come to where it has to be in 2040 and then continuing on into 2050. So this is the goal. And what we did as a group of researchers at UCL, together with our colleagues at GMF, at High Level Climate Champions, is trying to figure out that number. And the number we came up to is this 5 to 10%, which roughly equates to 0.6 exajoules of energy, or it equates to around 15 to 20 tons of, a million tons of HFO equivalent fuels. So that's really the understanding behind where we have to be to actually put us on that tipping point. And we've been doing this report now for about 4 years. So this is the 4th iteration of this report. So by this point, I hope we got some things right and really kind of created a set of indicators that are aligned with our understanding of how this transition has to take place. Now, we talk a lot about these alternative fuels in 5 to 10%. But what actually are these fuels? What do we define as these scalable zero-emission fuels? So this is where I want to start. Our definition is scalable zero-emission fuels that we use throughout the report. And this is somewhat different from the Z and Z definitions you see floating around. In our opinion, it's much more stringent because it has to, for a fuel to be classified as a scalable zero-emission fuel, it has to meet these 3 criteria. Number 1, it has to have net zero well-to-wake emissions, which in practice means it excludes fossil fuels, it excludes blue fuels, because here we heard the Secretary General talking about what the IMO is doing at the moment. But the goal of this report is to see how do you reach that tipping point for fuels you need in 2040 and in 2050. So that's why the definition is quite stringent. Number 2, it has to be price competitive within the current regulatory regime or the one that we can expect, i.e. with some carbon pricing compared to current conventional maritime fuels. So what does this mean? It means we're excluding some pathways that might not be realistically price competitive. This would be some methane pathways, some other pathways with some synthetic fuels as well. And finally, we're talking about these fuels being able to be produced at volumes. They have to be scalable. This is why we exclude some biofuels, or basically we exclude biofuels because we don't see them being scalable in the long term. So what are we left with? We're left with hydrogen-derived fuels, green ammonia, green hydrogen, and e-methanol, principally talking about those 3 fuels. And how do we measure progress towards 2030? Well, it goes back to what I said in 21, creating this transition strategy, discussing about a conceptual framework to actually see how we have to be and where we have to be by that point. And the framework is broken down into these 5 change levers. Now, each one of these levers is basically a group of indicators we use to follow progress, grouped around a common goal, whether it's technology, demand, finance. They're all interdependent, they all mutually reinforce each other or work against each other, depending on how you look at it. But they all have specific goals by 2030 that must be met. And then progress along those goals is looked at through a traffic light system of saying we're either on track, we're either partially on track, or we're not on track. So now we dive into some of these levers to actually understand all of the 5 levers and do a bit of research and a bit of analysis, explain some of the research and analysis behind the 5 levers. So starting off with technology and supply, the first lever that we looked at, we're saying it's partially on track. Now, you can look into the report, there's multiple indicators, there's a lot of goals, but in short, we're saying that by 2030, we expect there to be at least 0.6 exajoules in terms of energy of scalable zero-emission fuels in the supply for that minimum goal to be met. Are we meeting that at the moment? Well, in the high scenario, we are. But there's a lot of ambiguity in the pipeline, principally led by the fact that projects are being announced, but they're not all being developed, they're not all going according to plan, perhaps because the demand signal isn't there as strong as it would be. So we're partially on track. Looking at the demand, we're not on track. And this is connected to the supply. Why is demand not on track? Well, fundamentally, when we look at the order book, we do not see the number of ships and our estimate that we would have to have in 2030 to say that we're meeting those 0.6 exajoules. At the moment, we're saying we're somewhere around 200 ships likely to be in 2030, rather than 600 to 1,200 for large container ships equivalent that we would expect. So we're not on track. Then we go to the lever of finance. In terms of finance, we're really talking about ways and understandings of what sustainability-linked loans and what finance climate-aligned debt is there that can support development of scalable zero-emission fuel projects. And we're saying we don't really see there's sufficient finance available at the moment to lead us to that S-curve trajectory. It's simply not being seen in what we're seeing in the figures. Having said that, this is developing all the time, and it could change within the next few years or even within the next few months. But at the moment, we're not on that trajectory. And then in terms of civil society, this is a wider context. This is really looking at the wider shipping ecosystem. Civil society encompasses everything from seafarer training, whether seafarers actually are trained, upskilled to use these scalable zero-emission fuels, number one. Whether the wider community of NGOs is actually supporting the transition and pushing perhaps sports and local communities to get involved in this transition where that is necessary in terms of safety, in terms of production of these fuels. And number three, ensuring that there's a wide participation from all groups within this transition at the IMO and beyond. Now, we've seen some positive movement in terms of upskilling and workforce, but there's still much more remains to be done, especially in terms of participation. So we're saying we're partially on track. And then we come to the lever of policy. Now, we heard the Secretary General speaking about what has already happened at the IMO, what's happened with MEPC and with the Net Zero Framework. And this is a huge accomplishment and achievement for our organization that I've been following for a decade and many people have been following for much longer. It's really interesting to see everyone getting together and agreeing the Net Zero Framework. So it's definitely one of the critical moments in the last year. What I would also say is that in order for us to be fully on track, we need to see what happens next, i.e. what will be the definition of those Z and Zs, those zero and net zero fuels. Will it be aligned to the scalable zero emission fuels we hope it will be, or will it be a broader definition? What will be the reward mechanism and how will that reward mechanism actually be linked to supporting those fuels? Coming back to that point of how the regulations influence that price and the connection between them. And then finally, the timeline of when this will happen. Beyond this, there's the national aspect that's ambiguous, how do national governments support the transition, and then industry action, i.e. trickling down to the demand we saw earlier. So a lot of ambiguity yet, but some cause for optimism. So where are we overall? Well, overall, again, we're amber. We're partially on track. We're not there yet. We could be there. And principally to do with this interaction between regulatory developments, supply, and demand. And if you look at the figure to your right, which is a figure from the report, I would say if there's one figure to take from the report, it's this one. To your right, you see the interconnection between supply and demand. The blue bar is supply. You have three scenarios. The red bar is demand. These are our estimates where we have to be in 2030, and we project we could be in 2035. Over that, you have the 5% target, the 10% target, and then an extrapolated 2035% target. Now, as you can see, in the most optimistic scenario, we just about reach the goal for supply in 2030. For demand, we're not there yet. So in order to reach that demand figure, we would need to actually see more impetus on the order book. And this interconnection is key. Now, the reason why those figures might seem lower than you might find somewhere else for demand is because we do exclude LNG. We do exclude dual fuel engines. So it's a much more stricter estimate of what's happening. And this is why we're looking towards 2050. So can we reach that in 2030? Well, it's very difficult. It's not an easy ask. And it's probably really, really hard. But that's what we're talking about, these tipping points. Because what history has taught us in these transitions is once you have the right ingredients in place, they can go and snowball very, very rapidly. And that is what we're actually seeing in the industry. We're seeing all the ingredients being there in place in situ at the moment. So the question we should ask ourselves is not whether we will reach this goal necessarily in 2030, 2031, or 2032. The question we should ask ourselves is, are we going towards that goal? And the inevitable answer is yes, we are, because we actually see all the ingredients in place in all of these areas working jointly together. So then the question becomes, what is the real risk from someone saying, oh, it can't be reached or it can't happen? I would say the real risk isn't failing to meet exactly 5% in 2030. It's losing the sight of the breakthrough moment altogether. Losing the sight that it will happen and it has to happen eventually, as we heard from before as well. So the report is there, and I hope you can ask any questions afterwards and look forward to you reading it, hopefully, if you have time. Thank you.
So thank you, Domagoj, for that presentation. There's a lot to unpack there. As someone who's read the report, I know you really only skimmed the surface, so thanks for doing your best to condense it. I think we've had, both from you and from the previous discussions, a really good macro view of the issues that we're talking about in relation to this breakthrough objective. But we also saw a need in planning this event to get the micro view, to really look at the specific decisions that companies and organizations are making in their operations and how that relates to progress in the sector towards this goal. And that's what we're going to do now. I'm Jesse Fonestok. I'm Director for Decarbonization at the Global Maritime Forum, and I'm joined by a panel of representatives from organizations working across the value chain we've been talking about today. They're all developing their strategies and planning their investments, and they are making the decisions that will actually hopefully deliver the progress we're talking about on the ground and in practice. And that's what we want to take the time to do now, to talk to you all about the real world considerations that you're confronting in your business, but also hopefully to talk a little bit about the opportunities and levers for change that you see. What could impact your decisions positively? What could we do differently as a sector? And we've had a little bit of that again from the outside in or the top down perspective, and we want to hear a little bit about how it looks from your part of the value chain. So I will quickly introduce you each. I apologize for not giving you all your plaudits and covering your entire portfolio of responsibilities, because looking at the bios you submitted, it's just too much. You all have very difficult jobs. But once I've introduced you all, I'll proceed with a question for each of you. And assuming we have time, I'd love to get into some follow-up if anything that one of the panelists says sparks an idea or a response from you. We'd like to make time for that. So to my left, we have Barry Lavery, who's Global Head of Green Fuels at Renew. Among his many responsibilities, Barry oversees offtake for the company's green fuels projects in Europe and Asia Pacific, obviously two crucial markets for the shipping sector. Next to Barry, we have Haris Plakatonaki, who is, I've known Haris for 4 years. I still have to practice saying her name every morning before I have one of these. But I think I got it okay. She's Chief Strategy Officer at Starbulk, where among her many duties, she supports the sustainable fleet development at the organization. And next to Haris, we have Nicole Hearn, who's Head of Transactions at the Namibia Green Hydrogen Institute, where her focus is getting that country's green hydrogen projects to final investment decision. And next to Nicole, we have Nikos Petrakakos, who's Managing Director at Tufton Investment Management. Again, Nikos has a broad range of responsibilities, but he leads their work on investments in zero-emission shipping. You'll probably notice it's not an accident, the diversity of the panel here. We wanted to have a panel that broadly reflected the structure of the report that Domagoj presented. We have supply. Haris, you're standing in for demand with the vessel side. We have two people working on the finance side, one with a government remit as well. So hopefully we can see some nuances in those two perspectives. But I'm going to start with you, Barry, which is why I sat you next to me, and start with the fuel producer's perspective and move from upstream to downstream if we can. we heard a mixed picture from Domagoy. I think we all hear the rumblings in the marketplace, in the news. It's been, in some respects, a bumpy year for green hydrogen and its derivative fuels. There's also been some exciting developments, I think. And I wanted to sort of maybe go beyond what, for many of us, might seem like noise, a little hard to read, and ask you, when you're thinking about Renew's portfolio, what are the biggest considerations you're grappling with now? And you know, as a follow-up to that, what do you think needs to change in the marketplace or in policy or in the way maybe even your sector is doing business to accelerate the scaling up of green shipping fuels?
Perfect. We're 20 minutes for that.
Yeah.
Good luck. Okay, so just very briefly, Renew is India's largest independent power producer. We have about 18 gigawatts of operational and in construction assets in India, onshore wind, onshore renewables, onshore wind and onshore solar. And we do a portfolio of projects in, you know, pumped hydro, batteries, and sort of a key player in the energy transition in a market like India, which needs a huge amount of support. So, you know, we're playing from the perspective that green molecules, green fuels is the next transition that we've seen in the renewable energy space. So I think our biggest challenge is how we balance our portfolio of projects and developments in this space versus the renewable energy industry, which is growing in India at like 25% per year. So, you know, that's when we look at, can this be done? Yes, but I think it's also a balance of priorities in terms of where do we focus our time, where we see line of sight towards project investments. I think it's something that Nigel said earlier, which was around the S-curve, which I really sort of enjoyed. There's a big difference, however, between an S-curve and a hockey stick. And I think what we need to do as developers at the moment is look at project development, de-risk those projects so we can bring down the cost. It took a long time for the cost of renewables in a market like India to become competitive with coal and beat coal out in the market in terms of cost. That means we need to be working on these projects now, not in 2035 or 2040. So I think that's probably the first element in terms of how do we make these fuels available. We need to start now. We don't actually have that much time. I mean, the runway for some of these projects are, you know, 3 to 5 years at the minimum post FID, and the process to get to FID involves a lot of challenges. So I think if we work backwards from that perspective, of course, the concept of offtake or demand is critical. That becomes the first point for us to invest our own money, to work with financial partners, to invest in the projects and make these molecules available on time. But I don't think it's something that you can put onto the shipping companies. I mean, we have conversations with shipping companies all the time, and I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit later. But, you know, what is the type of fuel that we need? What is the cost of the fuel? What is the duration of the offtake? I mean, these are businesses that need to be run from an economical perspective. And I think that kind of questioning comes from the fact that we don't necessarily have all the answers in place today, and that requires some pretty major economic decisions. You know, one of our projects we're looking at investing in is close to $2 billion. Renewables all the way to the production facility. Financing is available, and we have quite a good conversation ongoing with our projects, with equity partners, project finance partners, but they need to see bankable projects. And as much as we would like to believe in this transition and invest in these projects, we need to bring the whole ecosystem together, and that includes the financial partners who see line of sight to investment. So I saw some of the summary from that report. I agree with the offtake. I agree with the financing piece. I think technology and manufacturing capacity is a function of line of sight towards offtake. The private companies are very good at investing when they see that sort of line of sight to the business. So we are working with electrolyzer companies. We've invested in our own solar module manufacturing facility of 6 gigawatts. We see the opportunity for investment in the space. Actually, British International Investment also put in about $100 million into our project earlier this year. And when you unlock the policy side with some certainty, private companies like ourselves are able to go and invest and make these fuels available. So I think, let me stop there, and I mean, I could talk for the rest of the day about this, but I think those are the sort of highlights there.
I think we'll definitely come back to some of those questions. I just wanted to flag something. You know, when we do this analysis, we look across the value chain very much in the spirit of what Nigel was saying earlier about the importance of the coordination of the different pieces. No one piece is more important than any other, but it's worth noting that the supply side is bigger than the rest, right? The size of the investments that Barry's talking about are massive. I think we estimated that more than 70% of the total investment needed for shipping transition will be on the fuel production side, right? So when we think about policy and when we think about structuring offtake, when we think about the demand side, we need to keep in mind the size and the risks associated with investments of that size. As someone who works with the shipping sector every day, we have to remind ourselves that actually this transition is about more than the shipping sector. And on that note, over to the shipping sector. Haris, when we think about the orders of new vessels and today, but also the long-term development of a fleet, I think there are a ton of considerations, and Barry already touched on some of them at a high level. I want to hear from you. What are the priorities for Star Bulk and also for, of course, the charters that you work with in terms of making choices about vessel orders now and planning for the long-term fleet development? And maybe, if you could share a little something about what kinds of new developments might move the needle and make orders of vessels that can run on, for example, methanol or ammonia more attractive for the sector.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. Hello, everyone. Allow me to start by noting that compared to where we were as an industry 6 months ago, there is much more clarity when it comes to regulation today. So we now have a regulatory framework. We know what type of measures are expected to be adopted. We have specific goals in place. We know the level of penalties. We know the time frame. Still, there are uncertainties when it comes to the regulation, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because, to your question, Jesse, it is very important for ship owners to make investment decisions to have regulatory certainty and clarity. For example, we still do not have the life cycle assessment of the fuels ready. And very important is that we do not know what the rewards will look like when we're talking about net zero fuels. And I want to be very specific here because this is something that is not being very widely discussed. Ship owners, along with environmental sustainability, which is their responsibility, of course, they also have responsibility to be financially sustainable. And you mentioned, Jesse, ammonia and methanol. And let's take these two fuels, for example. And let's assume that these fuels are widely available and safe to use, and we have the engines, and there is infrastructure as of January 2028. Let's assume that all these challenges and hurdles we overcome. And we look only into the financials, and you have the energy density of these fuels, which is much lower than fossil fuels, right? So compared to HFO, for example, you need approximately 2 times more methanol or ammonia to compensate for the energy density of 1 ton of HFO. How will the price look like of these fuels come 2028? We're not magicians. We cannot predict the future. We do have the IMO impact assessment study based on which the IMO made the decisions, where there are certain fuel price projections. So using those numbers, in 2028, HFO, as an example, is estimated at a little less than $500 per ton, while methanol and ammonia are estimated at around $1,000 per ton. And as I mentioned before, for 1 ton HFO, you need 2 tons of ammonia or methanol. So in order to compensate for $5,000 of 1 ton HFO, you need to pay $2,000 for ammonia or methanol. The point I'm trying to make here is that the cost gap is huge. And this makes it very important for ship owners to make decisions to see a reward system from the IMO being decided in order to compensate for the difference in the prices between fossil fuels and green fuels, net zero fuels, however we decide to call these fuels. To make a long story short, for ship owners to make investments, you need to have regulatory certainty, but you also need to see reward mechanism for the use of net zero fuels. Now, very briefly, if I may answer also your question around what we're doing, because of course, the shipping industry is not just waiting to see what will happen. We are taking a lot of steps, and it's not only Star Bulk, it's the entire industry that are focusing a lot on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through energy efficiency. This is something that needs to be discussed and needs to be addressed and needs to be recognized. And there are many ways today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through existing or developing technologies, whether we're talking about energy-saving devices, optimizing the operations of a vessel, fleet performance, optimizing speed, optimizing route, optimal arrival at port. A lot of focus is being placed on telemetry, so monitoring the performance of your vessels and identifying overconsumption cases and addressing those in a timely fashion. Hull maintenance, paying close attention to the hull of the vessel, making sure it is as clean as possible. Today, there are also developing technologies around hull cleaning, like remotely automated hull cleaning robots. All these are existing technologies, existing solutions that today help us reduce emissions without having to wait for new fuels to develop or for the regulation to advance. We are working on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We have recently established also the Maritime Emission Reduction Center. This is an Athens-based center where, together with other large ship owners, we are trying to advance technologies around the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a strategy we are following at the moment. We are also renewing our fleet. So in the last 2 years, we have sold more than 40 older, less efficient vessels as a means to further improve the environmental profile of our fleet. So a lot of work is happening on that front. We are staying abreast of developments around green fuels. And as I said before, we are waiting to have more regulatory certainty from the IMO and to understand what the rewards will look like. And once there is a business case in place that can also ensure the financial viability of our investments, we are here to make those investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Aris. And I think if we have time, I'd like to come back to the rewards. For those of you who haven't seen the report, one of the major takeaways is the crucial role that the proposed rewards for zero and near zero fuels will receive from the IMO Net Zero Fund will play in building that business case. And I think we all hopefully will have some perspective on that. I want to just say something quickly about energy efficiency, which is sort of formally out of the scope of this report and what we're talking about today. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the benefits of energy efficiency, which remain frustratingly uncaptured, if that's a word, in basically every sector, but even in shipping, are even more important in light of this transition with these more expensive fuels. The benefits from being optimized in your operations and having your technology optimized become even greater. So I do think it actually goes hand in hand with this transition to zero emission fuel use as well. I want to move on to Nicole. Nicole, Namibia's ambitions on green hydrogen have attracted a lot of attention. I think probably most people in this room are aware, at least, that there's that Namibia is something of a first mover country on green hydrogen. Part of the reason that I think it gets a lot of that attention is it's a potential example of how shipping's transition might create economic opportunities in the global south. And as that's an explicit goal of the IMO's revised strategy on greenhouse gases, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit with the imminent adoption of the Net Zero Framework in October on your expectations of how the IMO framework and the implementation thereof could support your efforts.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Yes, so in Namibia, we obviously are super excited about the opportunity for green industrialization and the opportunity to hopefully leapfrog our economy into participating in the economic growth and benefits that brings along. And we also super blessed with amazing solar resources and also where we are positioned geographically, given sort of Asia to Europe shipping routes, and obviously a lot of the vessels bypassing very congested ports in South Africa. So in terms of financial incentives, I mean, it's obviously a difficult question to kind of jump into for the audience without maybe the background of Namibia is utilizing quite a few blended finance mechanisms to really try support the development of the industry. Of course, we have a higher cost of capital than, you know, London or UK or Europe. And so we do use a lot of sort of alternative financing mechanisms. Most of our projects are in pilot phase, so we don't sort of have any large commercial NEOM type projects yet. But that's also because, of course, we don't have sovereign wealth funds to back our projects. So we utilize sort of government and private sector blended finance funds that provide development loans at 0% for sort of early phase CapEx. Then at FID, they will then operate into equity sort of positioning. So why I'm giving you this background before I answer your question is because you can really see the importance of financial mechanisms and alternative financing structures. Without that, and I think you mentioned that very well, with the cost gap between the grey and the green is large. And you know, even your projections by 28, there's still a doubling of cost. So how do we need to find ways to bridge that gap, because who's actually going to pay for that? And that's the challenging question. I mean, you can tell from the ship owners, they don't want to pay for that. They will only pay for that if it's, I think you said, a commercially viable case. And of course, governments in emerging markets also aren't able to pay for that gap. So we really are thinking about sort of using CFD mechanisms to try bridge the gap. So to bridge that green premium, or the greenium, as some people like to call it. And so we could implement sort of CFD mechanisms for the Global South as a way of funding these gaps. That way, we're not necessarily putting the cost on the producer, nor on a singular government. And going back to the IMO net zero funds, we hope that maybe part of the IMO net zero fund distributions can go to creating these kind of regionalized CFD mechanisms. Many other governments in Africa, I'm sure, from my conversations and various engagements, would also benefit from CFD mechanisms coming from sort of global taxation methods like the IMO Net Zero Fund. We also have Kenya, that's quite a far ahead mover in the space, and they're facing exactly the same challenges as we are. And many international developers that want to develop green fuels in Namibia, they have to take out sort of risk insurance, and that ends up costing around 14% more on an overall project basis because of that. So you can really see how sort of, and I mean, this is probably the case for Egypt, also Mauritania, that's quite advanced, Morocco, Namibia and Kenya in terms of advanced African potential producers, but really having a CFD mechanism coming from taxation funds that aren't necessarily linked to our government or Kenya's government, because the challenges, and sorry to now go into economics, but the challenge for government is you only have a certain risk budget to play with. And when you're looking at, I mean, we have our economy, there's a lot of poverty, and so we really have to think about how do we spend that risk budget? Do we provide medical care, or are we going to put it into a CFD fund for green fuels? Probably not the latter. And that's why we really need help from these sort of multilateral opportunities and these CFD mechanisms. And I think that will reflect Africa's view as well on a whole.
Thank you, Nicole. I think maybe it's worth pointing, well, hopefully many of you are familiar with the contents of the Net Zero Framework, but for those who are less familiar, the funds that are likely to be raised by the framework can be used to support the rewards to ship owners for using these fuels, but there's also another element that's designed to support a just and equitable transition. How exactly that will be designed will be a matter for the development of the guidelines, of course, but the kinds of mechanisms that Nicole is speaking about there is one potential use, right? That targeting those funds to support efficient subsidization through, for example, a contract for difference could be an innovative idea. So not to confuse the two pots, as it were, but hopefully they could be quite synergistic, right? That if you have stimulus for the off-takers and stimulus for the producers, that could be potentially an elegant solution. Nikos, I was actually going to ask you a question that Nicole has started to answer, but I think, coming from the private sector, pure private sector perspective, it's worth going into. I think it's fair to say that the bulk of shipping finance is sort of waiting on the business case that we've been talking about to go full bore into zero emission shipping. But I kind of want to turn that on its head and ask you, how can finance help make the business case? And I think Nicole threw a couple of ideas out there that are related to, for example, public finance. Is there something in private finance or hybrid finance that you think could move the needle and still work for investors?
I would say there definitely is, but I would preface that with maybe pointing out where the market is now and what are the types of investors and what are they looking for in shipping, right? On the one hand, where's the market now and maybe where it was a couple of years ago? If you ordered a dual fuel ship in 2021, it's cheaper than a conventional fuel vessel today because of where the market has gone. So back then, it was a much easier decision to invest than it is today. From there, then I'll go to sort of what are the investors. And we at Tufton, we've had a part in each of that. You have the more opportunistic investors, you have more the infrastructure kind of like investors that want more long-term certainty, and then you have the public funding. On the opportunistic side, those are the investors that came in that 2020, 2022 era. So it was easier to support some of these projects because it was historically low pricing, more ship owners were willing to make that case as well on a more speculative basis than they do now. Where we are now is, given where the price is, you need to de-risk it. And the way you de-risk it is you need to have that whole supply chain. You need to have the charter, who in turn needs the end user. And that is the link that's missing. A lot of the charters are coming in. They've made their announcements of what their targets are for 2030, 2050. But in turn, when they actually try to put pen to paper, they often hesitate to actually pull the trigger at the end. For a lender, for equity, you're not going to support a project, or even just the ship owners themselves. They can't support a project if it's not backed by something that de-risks it sufficiently for them. So I would say most of the success I've seen so far on the finance side is linked to more regional and governmental public finance support, whether that's Enova and EU grants out of Norway, whether that is the French tax lease system. They tend to be focused specifically on projects that support the local economy in some way, whether that supports developing the flag state or training crew, or whether it's the green corridors kind of thing, linking something to that nation. In a way that supports projects that are more defined in terms of their trade. And that's why you always see containers being the first, bulkers being one of the last to do that because of the way they trade. If what enables some of these projects tends to be linked to the country sort of impact, then it's going to be something that has more defined trade. And I think that's where we are now. And what's working seems to be this mix of this drive from the local governments, EU, etc., linking that to more certainty on long-term offtake not on the fuel, but on the vessel cargo chartering. Where I think maybe going back to what Harris was saying, linking it to the fuel efficiency side, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits and a lot of ship owners are not utilizing that, and lenders are not able to support that. Because of the way the framework is right now, if you were to provide financing for retrofits, anything you retrofit becomes part of the senior mortgage for the lender, so you cannot sort of do it like it is in aviation, where you finance the engine on its own. If that framework doesn't change, that significantly limits how much we can do on retrofits. And we're talking about alternative fuels. Unless we do everything we can on fuel efficiency, I think we're never going to get to where we need to on the fuels. We will need a lot more fuels than we do. The cost will be significantly higher. So before we talk about fuels, I think we need to talk about doing everything we can on fuel efficiency. And that would include changing the framework of how finance works so that you can maybe separately finance a retrofit. And that will require a lot of collaboration with all the banks and insurers and everyone to somehow create a framework there.
That's fascinating. I have multiple things I want to follow up from there, actually. And I'm really glad you mentioned some of the national government incentives that are actually working, right? And one of the findings of the report points to the role of national governments in sort of bridging the period between now and 2028. Obviously, we talk a lot about the IMO because the mass market transition is going to be dependent on global regulation. But I think that there is an interesting opportunity for national governments to create some incentives that can get some first mover investments going. And Barry, you and I were talking earlier about some of the recent auctions in India, for example, some of the developments, both positive and negative in a few other countries. And I'm wondering from a producer's standpoint, if you have good examples of national government initiatives that could help the marine fuel market.
Yeah, I think the first step on what governments have done is create certainty. So I think one of the challenges is, we talk about SADF or methanol or ammonia, but the standards. So from one of our projects, if we provide say an ammonia or a methanol to Europe, and then the same molecule to Japan, Korea, or even domestically in India, each of those markets currently has a different definition of what the molecule is. So RFMBO in Europe, KER for Korea, and India has its own sort of standardization. So I think that's, when we get into the detail of what's required, that standardization of molecules for the shipping industry is critical, because you won't be paying more expensive for a molecule that's destined for Europe if you're shipping in Asia Pacific. So I think that's the first sort of thing that governments can do. And in this case, I would sort of wrap in the IMO, and that definition of these fuels is going to be critical, because that has a major impact on what that final cost is going to be. I think in India, there's been a very good example from the renewable energy sector that is being translated into the sort of hydrogen sector, and that's been the role of governments in providing a backstop in terms of that visibility of revenue. So Solar Energy Corporation of India is one of those where effectively you've been given sort of a one-sided force majeure for developers to go and de-risk the projects. So that certainty of revenue has been critical in bringing that cost down. I see H2 Global here in the room. I think we're huge supporters of what has been done there in sort of the CFD mechanism. I think that's been a hugely valuable exercise, and sort of it continues to grow arms and legs, and I think that's going to be a major opportunity to getting these fuels into the market at a competitive base. And of course now recently in India, the pricing from the site tenders has been very impressive. But it's not necessarily the same molecule that will go into other markets, right? So I think you need to look at, number one, the standardization of those molecules is critical. I think number two, how the incentives also work. So are you incentivizing the reduction of production, the cost reduction in production, or are you incentivizing the cost reduction in terms of offtake? So the sales price effectively. I think that's where we need to see how does this work, because with all of these permutations of these different mechanisms, we don't necessarily get to see what is the real cost, and that is going to be a major sort of clarity that's needed.
Thank you, Barry. I wanted to follow up on something else you said, Nikos, about this the need to sort of restructure the commercial arrangements within finance, within lending, to enable lending to efficiency, for example. I think it goes to a general point of looking beyond policy. I think there's definitely a role for more commercial innovation. And Johanna said earlier that this is a very entrepreneurial sector. It's also an intensely competitive sector. And I wonder, and then with only 2 minutes left, this may end up being a rhetorical question, but I wonder if you think that there is a pathway for the sector to become a little bit more commercially innovative through joint ventures and partnerships that I think we're seeing too little of today, personally, and whether any of you have specific examples from this sector or from other sectors that you think could be particularly useful. Kadis, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Thank you, Jesse. and linking it also with the retrofits that Nikos mentioned, and since we also have IMO representation here today, technologies that enable us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like for example carbon capture and storage, or technologies, for example, wind-assisted propulsion. It's very important that also from a regulatory perspective we understand how these technologies, whether and how these technologies will enable us to improve the GFI of our vessels. Because once this is clear, then you will be amazed at the pace of acceleration of developments around these technologies. Once there is regulatory certainty that you can use these technologies to improve GFI vessels and comply with regulations. For example, we are in discussions with charterers in order to retrofit vessels with carbon capture and storage technology. But in the absence of a regulatory framework, we're not able to progress with these discussions. So once these technologies are embraced by the regulation, there is a lot of appetite out there, both commercially from charterers, but also from financiers. I mean, the banks we work with, they continuously reach out to us and ask us, you know, what needs do you have in order to decarbonize your fleet? Because also in their portfolios, they have certain targets to reach. So there is abundance of capital out there to fund these initiatives. There is appetite commercially also from charterers. We do need to see more clarity when it comes to how the regulation will incorporate these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Addison. I'm looking at my clock, and with 10 seconds left, I'd just like to thank you all. And you know, I think the level of detail we managed to get to in 35 minutes, Domagoj is probably quite jealous of our time allocation, but very substantive. Thank you all for participating today, and maybe we can give a round of applause before I hand off to you.
Right, well, it's come down to me to provide some closing remarks, and we've covered a huge amount of ground today, and thank you again to all of our panellists and presenters, and of course the Secretary General for addressing us this afternoon. This is the second time Maritime London has worked with UMAS and the GMF, and well, Catherine, to be honest with you, on an event during LISW, and I can say it's an absolute pleasure working with this team. And I think I need to say how lucky we are to have perhaps some of the most charismatic data scientists in the game producing this report and holding industry's feet to the fire. Now, I'm an optimist by nature, I suppose, but optimism without a dose of reality can do more harm than good. And I think we've had a healthy dose of reality from our panellists today. However, I don't think that we should, as Johanna said, lose sight of how far we have come as an industry in the last 5 years. And thanks to an awful lot of people in this room, actually, the way in which the narrative about how we decarbonise this industry has fundamentally changed. And of course, both the technical and commercial innovation that we have seen in the market to help facilitate that change. And, you know, it was interesting to hear Nikos speak on, you know, mechanisms such as full expense leasing and how governments can potentially use government-based guarantees to provide protections around residual risks. And I think we really need to see an acceleration of that in the market over the next 5 years if we're going to fulfill that 2030 ambition. So what I want to say in closing, I suppose, is that politicians come and go, and nation-state policies around decarbonisation can be dynamic, I think is the best way to put it. But what we have achieved in this sector is at least an overall top-level agreement on how we can achieve an orderly, equitable, multilateral transition. And for me, now is not the time to blink or be swayed in that ambition. And in fact, we need to emphasise the importance of meeting the 2030 ambition and the need to maintain a global consensus around how this industry is going to decarbonise to ensure we're not only doing the best thing in terms of the planet, but we can do this in a stable and equitable manner. And I think that's everything from me for now. All I've got to say is, talking about objective data, you all put a sticker on the chart outside when you arrived to show your thoughts as to where we were in terms of meeting the 2030 ambition. If your opinion has changed over the duration of this event, please do put a sticker, I think it's going to be a different colour, hopefully, as to where you think we are on the 2030 ambition now. But that's everything from me. Catherine, thank you so much again, and thank you all for participating and attending today.